Hello YouTube. So in this video we're going to look at scientism. What exactly is scientism? Well, Alex Rosenberg in The Atheist's Guide to Reality defines scientism as follows. He says that scientism is the conviction that the methods of science are the only reliable ways to secure knowledge of anything, that science's description of the world is correct in its fundamentals. And he continues, he says, being scientistic just means treating science as our exclusive guide to reality and to nature, both our own nature and everything else's. So the idea of scientism then is that scientism provides the only means for forming reliable beliefs. And obviously it follows from this that science or scientific methods should be extended into disciplines that are not normally taken to be scientific. For instance, ethics, aesthetics, metaphysics, legal scholarship, history, anthropology, etc. These disciplines should become more scientific. It's only by applying scientific methods that we will be able to answer the basic questions of these disciplines. Basically, science is a form of inquiry far superior to any other. Everything that can be known through science, while other forms of inquiry provide, at best, only weak and unreliable access to the facts of their domains. Now, as you're probably aware, the term scientism is often used pejoratively to refer to what the critics consider to be inappropriate attempts to expand science beyond its proper scope, or to excessive optimism in the ability of science to answer any questions, or excessive pessimism about the abilities of non-scientific disciplines. Now, in this usage, scientism is by definition a bad thing. Scientism, by definition, means overestimating the abilities of science. In this video, we're going to use the term scientism in the more neutral way, just to label the view that science is the only reliable source of beliefs. There are some people who explicitly defend scientism, like Alex Rosenberg, and of course there are plenty of people who have been accused of scientism. Many naturalists, physicalists, and empiricists have been accused of scientism. So what we're going to ask in this video is, well, what exactly is wrong with scientism? Is it really a criticism to say that a person's views are scientistic? What is wrong with the view that that science is the only reliable way to secure knowledge of anything? Now, one tendency that's worth noting just right from the start is that some defenders of scientism tend to support their views by defining science in very broad terms, so that science simply refers to any kind of careful reasoning based on empirical evidence. And if you define science broadly enough, then fields like ethics and metaphysics and epistemology and legal scholarship and history and so on are perfectly fine as they already are, because they already count as sciences. Indeed, even theology and some religions might count as sciences if you define science broadly enough, because people certainly use reasoning and argument and so on to defend their religious beliefs. So if you adopt a broad enough definition of science, then scientism is almost certainly correct. It's also totally uninteresting. So in this video, we're going to take science to refer specifically to professional academic fields like physics, chemistry, biology, and so on. Those are the, let's say, the paradigm sciences that we will take to be definitional of what science is. Now, there are basically two, approaches to scientism that are perhaps worth bearing in mind the distinction here. On the one hand, there is what we might call methodological scientism, which is the view that disciplines like history and philosophy should adopt the methods and the standards of the natural sciences. The traditional questions posed by such disciplines are perfectly reasonable questions. It's just that we need to apply science to answer them. So consider the application of neuroscience, for instance, to traditional moral problems, or the survey method of experimental philosophy. These are attempts to answer traditional philosophical problems, but by applying scientific methods. Somewhat more radical is eliminative scientism, which is the view that the problems dealt with in non-scientific disciplines should be just left aside or eliminated or dismissed. Such problems cannot be solved by the means of science, and so discussion of these problems is just worthless or confused. The very questions being asked in non-scientific disciplines are confused. Consider the people who argue that science has shown us that morality, for instance, is simply an illusion, or take the eliminative materialism defended by people like Paul and Patricia Churchland. So, according to eliminative materialism, traditional folk psychology cannot be made scientific and so should be just eliminated in favour of advanced neuroscience. Obviously, you can have you can apply methodological scientism and eliminative scientism to different domains depending on what your views are of the merits of those domains. So as I said, today we're interested in the question of, well, what exactly is wrong with scientism? And one obvious way to attack scientism would be to hold that we have knowledge that is beyond the limits of science. Science can't tell us everything there is to know. What might the limits of science be? Well, one possibility here is morality. Moral questions can't be answered by science, at least not by science alone. So I'm sure you're familiar with Hume's is-ought gap. You can't infer an ought from an is. You can't infer a normative statement from a descriptive statement. Now, moral theories tell us what we ought to do. Scientific theories only ever describe what is the case. Scientific theories only ever describe how the world works. Science never tells us how the world ought to be. And since you can't derive a normative statement from a descriptive statement, science can't answer moral questions, so it can't provide us with moral knowledge. So moral knowledge is beyond the reach of science. Now this is of course controversial. One obvious objection to this proposal is just to deny that there is any moral knowledge. Many people defend anti-realism about morality. You might want to check out my series on meta-ethics for more on this, but if you're a moral anti-realist, you will hold that there are no moral facts. So slavery is wrong, for instance, is not something we know, right? That's not a truth that we have discovered. Moral anti-realists will say that either all moral statements are simply false, or maybe moral statements are functioning in other ways. Perhaps they function merely as expressions of emotion or expressions of commands or whatever. But whatever the precise account of the meaning of moral statements, moral anti-realists will say that actually there really isn't any moral knowledge. There are no moral facts. So perhaps that's one way to get out of the problem of moral knowledge. Another proposal for knowledge that might be beyond the reach of science is mathematical knowledge. This is discussed by Alex Rosenberg in his article Philosophical Challenges for Scientism. So mathematical objects such as numbers, sets, points, functions and so on are in some sense abstract objects. They don't exist in space and time, and so we can't stand in causal relations with them. So the number 3 in itself can't cause anything. Obviously there's a difference between having 3 particular things and having 2 particular things, and that difference will have causal consequences. But if you think of 3 in itself, the number 3 independently of any particular instantiation of 3 things, well, that number is abstract and it has no causal powers. And the same is the case for pretty much every other mathematical object, like sets and functions, etc. Now this is a problem because, according to Rosenberg anyway, scientism is committed to a causal account of knowledge. Science investigates causal regularities in the world. Science describes the causal regularities in the world. Any scientific explanation for how humans acquire knowledge must be in terms of such causal regularities. So we know about the world because we can enter into causal relations with aspects of the world. Take visual perception. Vision delivers reasonably reliable knowledge of objects in the world, and this works because light reflects off the objects and enters our eyes, and that causes a pattern of stimulation on our retinas, and then that information is transformed and sent to the visual cortex, and so on. I know that there is a cup on the table in front of me, and I know this because there's a causal connection between the cup and my belief about the cup. because of the way the light hits the cup, goes into my eyes, causes that pattern on my retina, etc. That is the kind of causal chain that leads to reliable beliefs. So knowledge has to be explained in terms of these kinds of causal chains, causal regularities, if we're to have a scientific explanation, a scientific account of knowledge. But then how can we have knowledge of mathematics? Mathematics, as we said, the mathematical objects have no causal powers. Now, as Rosenberg notes, it's much harder for a defender of scientism to deny mathematical knowledge than to deny moral knowledge. I mean, one reason for this is just because mathematics seems to provide us with knowledge that is far more secure than that from other domains. Mathematical truths can be proved. Indeed, empirical science, even at its best, can't achieve absolute certainty. And of course, in the case of something like morality, well, even if you're a moral realist, you'd probably admit that your moral beliefs are fallible. In a way, whereas with mathematics, we have logically secure, certain proof. But the second reason why anti-realism about mathematics is difficult for scientism is that mathematics appears to be indispensable to science itself. You can have a science without morality, but you can't have a science without mathematics, or at least so it seems. If you were to adopt some sort of anti-realism about mathematics, that would immediately raise the question of why wouldn't that anti-realism extend to other features of scientific theories? And then that would undermine the claim that science has to provide a totally correct description of the world. So for these kinds of reasons, Rosenberg calls mathematics the problem from hell for scientism. Interestingly, Rosenberg's own response to this is to suggest that, well, mathematics is basically a problem for everybody, not just scientism. Nobody has yet come up with an adequate epistemology and metaphysics of mathematics. So even if you hold that there are non-scientific sources of knowledge and that perhaps we have, basic mathematical intuitions that, are somehow different from the sort of intuitions or whatever that we might use in science, well, we're still in the dark about what justifies those intuitions. The fundamental problem with mathematics is that if there are abstract objects, they are completely sealed off from human thought, which is a physical process. Nobody really understands how mathematical knowledge can work, according to Rosenberg. So this isn't really a objection that is specific to scientism. Although, of course, that doesn't exactly solve the problem. It just suggests that everybody else has the same problem. Okay, a second objection to scientism is the science cannot stand alone argument. So the basic idea of this argument is that in order to do science, we must hold many beliefs about the world that are not themselves derived from science. In order to gather data that we use to test hypotheses, we must believe in the reliability of our senses and our memory. In order to evaluate how evidence bears on hypotheses, we have to accept the validity and applicability of certain logical systems. For example, we have to accept that modus tollens is a valid argument form. And perhaps in constructing theories, we maybe have to make certain broad metaphysical assumptions, such as the uniformity of nature or belief in an external world. So the point is that without knowledge beyond what science itself provides, science can't even get started. I guess another way to put the point is that there is a host of common sense knowledge that is not scientific knowledge, and much of this common sense knowledge is employed in constructing scientific theories. Biologists come to understand the living world by making careful observations with instruments like electron microscopes, and they appeal to sophisticated theory. But how does all of that start? Well, you start by just going out and looking around and observing the living world with your eyes. You might see an animal behaving in a particular way and infer that it's searching for food or something like that. That kind of simple everyday reasoning delivers reliable knowledge too. And of course, you have to suppose that your eyes are reliable if you're going to trust what you see when you use an electron microscope. So the common sense beliefs like this, that an animal is searching for food, that my eyes are reliable, these are not themselves scientific beliefs, but they seem to in some sense form the basis of science. So scientists inevitably rely on non-scientific sources of beliefs. According to scientism, non-scientific sources of beliefs do not deliver knowledge. We cannot form reliable, justified beliefs on the basis of non-scientific sources of belief. But then it follows that science can't deliver reliable knowledge either. It's constructed on an unreliable base. So it might be worth just noting as an aside that I've stated this argument in, foundationalist terms. But if you're a coherentist, you could make a very similar argument. So framing the argument in coherentist terms, we would say that scientific theories are justified partly through coherence with beliefs acquired from non-scientific sources. Both the scientific and the non-scientific beliefs count as part of a overall coherent system of knowledge. Now Rick Peels, in his article The Fundamental Argument Against Scientism, considers a couple of responses to this argument. The first response that Peels considers is that the problem here is only really a local problem, in that it can only ever apply to a particular field of science. If we look at science as a whole, then we can correct beliefs in one scientific field by using beliefs formed from another scientific field. So by analogy, imagine you set out to sail on a ship, and the ship contains enough wooden boards to build another ship of the same size. Now each day you replace some of the boards of your ship with these new boards until the entire ship is built out of new material. So in the same way, the idea here is, well, we begin with purely non-scientific knowledge. We begin with beliefs derived from purely non-scientific sources, but then we replace these non-scientific beliefs bit by bit. Once we've established an institution of science, we can use that to replace these non-scientific beliefs bit by bit until we end up with a set of beliefs, none of which are based on non-scientific sources. And after all, there is no question that the results from science are used to correct common sense beliefs. Just consider how faulty our common sense intuitions about probability are. Scientific research corrects our common sense intuitions. Now, Peels objects that this doesn't really solve the problem. One issue here is that although some non-scientific common sense beliefs have been corrected by science, in fact, the vast majority of common sense beliefs remain untouched. Almost all of our everyday beliefs based on perception, memory, and intuition have never been revised by science or replaced with beliefs from a scientific source. So my belief, for instance, that there is a cup on the table in front of me, that is not and never will be replaced or replaced by some different belief that is from science, nor will it be, justified by scientific methods, right? I mean, it's just a common sense belief. I just see that there's a cup on the table in front of me, and that's that. That's not something that's going to be, going to become scientific or be replaced by a scientific belief. More seriously, Peels suggests that this metaphor of the ship at sea is simply misleading in this context. The problem here is that when we start off with a set of only non-scientific beliefs and then begin to acquire scientific beliefs, at least some of the non-scientific beliefs transfer their rationality or their justification to the scientific beliefs. So you don't really, it's not that you sort of throw out, as it were, all of the non-scientific beliefs in the way that you just throw out the old planks of a ship. The situation is that, that those non-scientific beliefs, if they're not justified, then of course the scientific beliefs based on them can't be justified either. So, so this analogy here with the ship, it just doesn't work here. Okay, so another response to the science cannot stand alone argument is to revise scientism slightly. Here's a simple statement of revised scientism. We might say that revised scientism tells you to accept beliefs derived from science and from those faculties that are necessary for doing science. The only reliable sources of knowledge are science and those sources of belief that are necessary for doing science. So we can accept beliefs formed on the basis of perception, memory, perhaps some forms of intuition, such as basic logical intuitions and so on, because those sources of beliefs are the sources of belief that are used in doing science. Now, to be fair, I guess this kind of move isn't so ad hoc. After all, one of the motivations for scientism is a sense of, kind of significant respect for science. So if science is built on common sense, then scientism accepts common sense as well, at least in certain contexts. But one of the big problems with this kind of move is that it's questionable whether revised scientism is really a kind of scientism at all. Now, I noted earlier at the beginning of this video that defenders of scientism, when challenged, will often broaden their definition of science to include any kind of reasoning or evidence-based argument. And in that sense, scientism is simply not an interesting position. I think that revised scientism, as defined here, similarly threatens to be too broad to be interesting. So, I mean, what does revised scientism actually rule out, right? If you think about, philosophy, right? Even philosophy at its most abstract is derived from the same base of common sense knowledge and common sense reasoning as the sciences are. So consider, for instance, debates about whether we are justified in believing in the existence of an external world. Here's a simple argument for skepticism. You know that the external world exists only if you know that you aren't dreaming, but you don't know that you aren't dreaming, so you don't know the external world exists. This philosophical argument is based on the common sense observation that there's a distinction between waking consciousness and dreaming. It's based on the common sense observation that waking consciousness and dreams are experientially indistinguishable. So that is, we sometimes don't know that we are dreaming. And it also uses a kind of basic logical argument form. So it would seem then that revised scientism allows this, debates about this kind of argument. It allows philosophy, actually quite abstract philosophy, I guess non-practical philosophy. Indeed, even subjects like astrology are based on common sense sources of beliefs. Astrologers will use their capacity of visual perception when observing movements of planets. They will employ reasoning in terms of how particular planetary movements are likely to impact a person's life. So astrologers appeal to sensory data and to a background of theory to draw their conclusions. So it turns out that revised scientism allows a host of common sense non-scientific beliefs from which we can then reason to other non-scientific beliefs, non-scientific sources of beliefs. The other problem here concerns the justification for revised scientism. The point of scientism is that there is something special about scientific sources of belief. But on revised scientism, we're allowing a host of non-scientific sources of belief, in which case, why not include moral intuitions or metaphysical intuitions or whatever? I mean, once we admit that some non-scientific sources of belief are acceptable, isn't it rather arbitrary and dogmatic to just immediately rule out all of the others? I mean, there may be good reasons to think that moral intuitions don't provide knowledge. Indeed, I'm a moral anti-realist, so I would agree with that. But obviously, objecting to a particular source of belief, a particular non-scientific source of belief, isn't necessarily scientism. Scientism involves objecting to that source of belief specifically because it's a non-scientific source of belief. So once you allow that some non-scientific sources of belief are acceptable, it's not really clear how you could defend objecting to some source of belief on the grounds that it's non-scientific. So that's a problem for scientism. Now, one of the primary objections to scientism is that scientism is self-refuting. And this is discussed, for example, by Rick Peels in his article Scientism and the Argument from Self-Referential Incoherence. The basic argument here is very straightforward. Scientism is the view that science is the only reliable source of knowledge. But scientism is not, perhaps cannot, be supported by science alone. So scientism entails that scientism is unjustified. Another way to put this is that scientism is not itself a scientific position. It's a philosophical position. So what might we say in defence of scientism? Well, one obvious response to this is to try to show that scientism actually is supported by scientific evidence. Moti Mizrahi, in his article What's So Bad About Scientism, suggests an argument along these lines by examining research output. He finds that the arts and humanities comprises only about 1 to 3% of total research output. The rest is from the natural sciences, medical sciences, social sciences. So we can show quantitatively that the vast majority of research is scientific research. One of the goals of an academic discipline is publication, and in this respect, the sciences are quantitatively better, since the sciences are responsible for a higher proportion of academic publications. Furthermore, we can consider the utility of academic work by looking at citation counts. Mizrahi finds that 12% of medical articles, 27% of natural science articles, and 32% of social science articles are never cited. In comparison, 82% of humanities articles are never cited. So the majority of humanities articles appear to have no further influence on the subjects. They're published and then forgotten, whereas most science articles do have a further influence. So overall then, a scientific analysis of academic research shows us that the sciences have greater research output and greater research impact than do the humanities. Now, obviously, this argument is a very long way off from establishing scientism. I mean, these are very crude measurements of the worth of a discipline, of the value of a discipline. In fact, I think one could say that they're not really measurements of the value of a discipline at all. It seems pretty simple-minded to look at statistics like these and conclude that science is superior. I mean, in principle at least, it's entirely possible that a field could produce a large amount of just rubbish research, and that the members of the field could cite each other enough that most of the articles have high citation counts. So I don't think that this in itself really tells us anything. Or it might be the case with humanities. Maybe the majority of humanities research is of poor value, but there's 10% that's really great and that's really important. That in itself would refute scientism, because we're not just scientism isn't just the view that say science is better. It's that science is the only reliable source of knowledge. If there is some humanities work that is a reliable source of knowledge, then scientism should be rejected. And notice, of course, that if you were to apply Mizrahi's method, say, 500 years ago, you might find that most research was in the field of religious debate, Bible studies, theology, that kind of thing. So, these statistics are very contingent. We happen to do much more science now, but that wasn't always the case. But of course, there's a more serious problem with this argument, which is, the fact is, even if in principle scientism could be supported by scientific evidence, at present it is not. Mizrahi's argument at best only hints at how you might go about gathering scientific evidence for scientism, but certainly there's nothing like a consensus among scientists today that scientism is correct. Yes, I'm sure a few scientists support scientism, but this isn't really on the basis of any scientific research, and there are plenty of scientists who don't support scientism. Scientism is not an established scientific hypothesis, and that leaves defenders of scientism in a tricky position, because on the one hand they dismiss non-scientific sources as unreliable, but on the other hand they have to accept that their own position is not actually acceptable by the standards of their own epistemology, because it's not an accepted scientific position. So, by their own lights, their rejection of non-scientific sources is simply dogmatic and unjustified. It's not something that's supported by adequate evidence, because it's not something that is accepted in the sciences. So scientism is not currently accepted in the sciences. So yes, it's not clear then that we can respond to the self-refutation argument by appealing to scientific evidence, as long as it remains the case that scientism is not an established scientific hypothesis. I think this problem is still going to remain. Okay then, so another objection to scientism is given by Ian James Kidd in his article, "Is Scientism Epistemically Vicious?" And he suggests that scientism exhibits the epistemic vice of close-mindedness, that is, of being closed to epistemic possibilities. Scientism is dogmatic. Dogmatism is obviously bad in itself. Nobody wants to be close-minded and dogmatic, or at least nobody should want to be close-minded and dogmatic. That's a bad way to be. But it's much worse for scientism specifically, because dogmatism is really in opposition to the open-minded spirit of the scientific enterprise. So science itself is not scientistic, and it would become poorer if it were scientistic. Science involves a kind of open-minded consideration of a variety of theoretical possibilities. And Ian James Kidd's worry is that scientism immediately closes down many avenues of inquiry, avenues that actually could be of benefit to science. So the closed-mindedness of scientism manifests in a couple of ways. First, those who accept scientism will be closed to engaging with scholars working in other disciplines. Scientism holds that science is the only reliable source of knowledge. Other disciplines are therefore basically a waste of time. Since they are not scientific, we already know that they have nothing to offer. But in fact, there have been scientists who have engaged fruitfully with scholars in other fields. For instance, Ernst Mayr and Stephen Jay Gould were both biologists who engaged often with philosophers and historians of biology. And if you read some of their work in biology, you can sometimes see these influences from other disciplines. Many university departments try to encourage a sort of interdisciplinary engagement. Second, scientism is closed to the possibility of other ways of seeing the world. So being open-minded involves trying to see things from another person's point of view. It involves adopting other theories and stances and considering the best arguments for them and sort of steel manning them, as the saying goes. You take a theory or a stance that you disagree with and you try to make it as strong an opponent as possible. You acknowledge that your own theories and stances might have flaws that could be exposed by adopting different points of view. But scientism is just the view that science is essentially without limit, that all useful knowledge is produced by the sciences, and other stances are simply unreliable. Scientism, somebody who accepts scientism is not likely to consider other points of view in this kind of fair and open-minded way. Now, obviously, I think defenders of scientism are likely to protest here. I think they will say, well, look, we are open-minded and we do admit that we could be wrong. And actually, this seems like a fair enough point to me. Whenever I've listened to people who could plausibly be said to accept scientism, they do seem to acknowledge that their own beliefs might turn out to be mistaken. Indeed, often one of the reasons why they tend to admire science is because they believe that science has especially efficient mechanisms for weeding out false beliefs. And they expect that some of their beliefs will turn out to be false in the future. Certainly looking at the history of science, we can see that it has caused some pretty major conceptual changes. The Copernican revolution, evolution by natural selection, quantum mechanics. These are theories that totally overthrew our previous view of the world. And I think that, even most people who accept scientism would say that, it's pretty likely that some of the things we believe are going to turn out to be wrong in the future. But Kidd is unconvinced by this point. So he argues that while those who accept scientism may concede that they could be wrong about some things, they will hold that any criticism or challenge to their view must proceed from a kind of physicalist, naturalist perspective. On scientism, only physical evidence produced by practices and institutions that presuppose physicalism and naturalism could challenge accepted scientific theory. So, this can perhaps be seen in the way that scientism often involves a kind of reductionism, the view that physics tells us in principle the whole truth and nothing but the truth. For practical reasons, of course, we distinguish different scientific fields and we don't frame everything in terms of physical facts, fundamental physical facts. But the thought is that the kind of higher level facts, as it were, the facts of chemistry, the facts of biology, follow from the physical facts. Any change in our worldview must be compatible with the theories accepted in physics. So there's no way that metaphysical or religious inquiry, for example, could actually challenge the views of somebody who accepts scientism. I don't know if I find this particular criticism of scientism so persuasive. I guess the main problem for me is, surely almost any view that you hold will end up closing off certain areas of inquiry in a similar kind of way. There are many reasons why you might, for instance, reject Christianity. Maybe you reject Christianity because you embrace scientism, or maybe you reject Christianity because you think there are powerful philosophical arguments against theism. You engage with philosophy, you think philosophy is a useful discipline, and you think philosophy has shown that theism is just nonsensical. Or maybe you reject Christianity because you accept some other religion, like Islam or Buddhism. Whatever your reasons for your rejection of Christianity, you're going to be less likely to engage with scholarly work on the details of Christianity. I guess the fact is you can't have a completely open mind. For all of us, there are going to be theories and views that we just don't take seriously. And more generally, if I say that some source of belief is more reliable than another source of belief, or even that some source of belief is completely unreliable, I think it's still possible to put yourself in the shoes of those who accept that other source of belief. So, just considering my own views, I don't think I accept scientism, but I would say I'm an empiricist, and like many empiricists, I have a very negative opinion of a lot of metaphysics. But I think I'm still capable of considering metaphysical debates and putting myself in the shoes of people who sort of build those sophisticated metaphysical systems. Indeed, I quite enjoy doing that. I made a few videos on modal realism, for example. In my view, modal realism is complete nonsense. It's not just that it's wrong, it's totally misguided in its basic assumptions about how to go about investigating reality. I could not think that a position could be more ridiculous than modal realism, but I think I presented it fairly. I think I presented it in a fair way in those videos. I'm not convinced that accepting scientism necessarily makes you close-minded. Indeed, I might suggest that to assume that everybody who accepts scientism is close-minded and dogmatic, that in itself seems a bit close-minded and dogmatic. A final objection to scientism is that scientism presupposes that there is a single unified enterprise that we call science. It supposes that the thing that we call science, all of the different fields and different research groups, all of these share some sort of essential feature, essential property that make them all scientific. There is a single scientific method shared by all scientific disciplines. There is a single world view or single world picture that is constructed by science as a whole. Now, this is very questionable. Many philosophers have argued that science is fundamentally disunified. There is not one single thing, science, rather there are many sciences, all with actually quite different methods and that make quite different presuppositions. Scientism rests on drawing a distinction between scientific and non-scientific knowledge, and it views the sort of it views that as an epistemically significant distinction. The scientific knowledge is the good stuff, and the non-scientific knowledge is the bad stuff. But if we accept that science is disunified, then this distinction looks sort of arbitrary. What we call science is actually a collection of a host of different methods that we should expect will change through time, and it's a collection of a host of different disciplines which are all of differing value. So, theoretical physics is very different from microbiology, which is very different from paleontology, which is very different from analytical chemistry. There is, of course, a kind of abstract way of stating the scientific method, which would go something like this. You propose a hypothesis, then you make predictions, then you test the predictions. If the predictions are correct, build on the hypothesis. If the predictions are incorrect, alter the hypothesis. But the problem is that this very abstract statement masks a host of differences. And actually, in any case, with a method stated that abstractly, it's probably the case that a variety of non-scientific disciplines will also count as employing the scientific method. So for example, some sciences emphasize are sort of built on intervening and experimenting with the entities in their domain, as in experimental physics, where you have the particle accelerators and you collide the particles together to investigate them. This kind of thing is impossible in astronomy, which is fundamentally observational. We can't go out and manipulate a star in the laboratory in the way that we can manipulate atoms in the laboratory. So we learn about stars by observing millions and millions of stars at different stages of their life cycles. We just collect masses of data that sort of give us pictures of the whole life cycles of the stars, and in that way we can come to conclusions about stars. And both of these kind of contrast with climate science. In climate science, we can't intervene or experiment with the climate system in the way that we can with entities like atoms. For one thing, the climate system is just too complex with lots of different variables that can't be held fixed. And in any case, we only have one planet, and the effects of climate change occur over too long a time period. If we had millions of planets at our disposal and we could speed up the passage of time on them, the methods of climate science might be very different. We might approach climate science much as we approach experimental physics. We could pump different amounts of greenhouse gases into all the different planets and see what happens, or something like that. But obviously we can't do that. So, like astronomy, climate science isn't exactly, you can't sort of experiment with the entity in its domain. But unlike astronomy, we don't have countless data points of climate systems like our own. So we can't observe millions and millions of Earth-like climate systems that are undergoing changes like ours. Instead, we have to be content with models and computer simulations and so on. So there are some quite significant differences between scientific disciplines in that sense. Similarly, you often find scientific disciplines sort of shading into non-scientific disciplines, such as the use of thought experiments in physics, which are quite similar to thought experiments in philosophy. Many thought experiments can't be put to an empirical test, and even when they can be put to empirical test, it's often not necessary. Consider Galileo's famous falling object thought experiment. So the Aristotelian worldview was that heavier objects fall faster than lighter ones. Galileo proposed a thought experiment where he asked, well, what would happen if you attached a heavy ball to a light ball with a piece of string? Would this combined heavy ball, light ball, would that combined thing fall faster or slower than the heavy ball alone? Well, since lighter objects fall slower, the lighter ball should act as a brake and slow down the heavy ball, hence the combined ball would fall slower. But since the overall weight of the combined ball is heavier than the heavy ball alone, the combined ball should fall faster. So we have a contradiction. And so Aristotle's theory must be rejected. This experiment could have been performed, but most historians think that it wasn't actually performed, that it was just a thought experiment. And it seems like you don't really need to perform it to make the point Galileo was making, at least arguably. And so this is the same kind of reasoning that you often find in philosophical literature. On the other hand, you don't find thought experiments like these in, molecular biology, for instance, at least not nearly to the same extent. So there are a whole bunch of different scientific disciplines, and these disciplines are not all of the same value. Modern physics, for example, arguably doesn't exhibit the kind of rapid progress that it saw in the early 20th century with general relativity and the quantum revolution. In fact, Lee Smolin, in his book The Trouble with Physics, he argues that there have been no major revolutionary discoveries in physics since the proposal of cosmic inflation in the early 80s. There have been some striking results in recent years, but these results have generally been such as to confirm theories that were already well established, like CERN's detection of the Higgs boson in 2012, which confirmed the standard model of particle physics, LIGO's detection of gravitational waves in 2016, that confirmed general relativity. But there haven't exactly been these sort of major steps forward that physics saw in the early 20th century. Furthermore, there's increasing concern that many recent theories in physics, such as M theory, supersymmetry, the multiverse, string theory, are not supported by empirical evidence, and in some cases, just untestable, and so could never be supported by empirical evidence. I mean, I'm not, I don't know physics well enough to judge this point, but see the work of Lee Smolin, Peter Woet, and Jim Baggott for some concerns that have been raised about modern physics. Obviously, this is arguable, but the point is just there's a serious worry here that in treating science as this kind of single unified enterprise that is uniformly reliable, scientism becomes unreasonably uncritical of certain areas of science. According to scientism, science determines what is correct. There is no higher standard than science. Science just is the only reliable source of knowledge. So, that it becomes very difficult to see how to criticize these kinds of developments in physics, where it actually seems like that there might be some legitimate concerns here. So that was scientism and some of the reasons why we might consider scientism to be implausible. Okay, thanks for watching. Goodbye.